inaugural, our first meeting of our colloquium on teaching and learning and theology and religious studies. We're also, we're also branching out, and I've reached out to the School of Philosophy as well. And so, because there's a lot of things that sort of cross over between, within all the humanities, and we're all teaching the same students. So we're going to be teaching the same students, and so a lot of these topics cross over. But there are some topics that are particular to theology and religious studies that we can discuss and address. But so thank you for coming. Our format, essentially, we have Sister Margaret Schreiber, and she's going to just present material for a little bit, and then we'll open up. Really, this is discussion driven, and so your input, your questions, and how do we best achieve student engagement, how do we best achieve student interaction and success in our courses. We do have two more coming up this semester. We have Dr. Bosworth on November 12th, same time, Tuesday, November 12th, and we have Dr. Miller on December 3rd. And then we'll have a schedule for the spring semester coming out as well. So hopefully these are, we'll have a few of these each quarter, or each semester. So come together and talk about teaching. So, all right, with that, I turn it over to Margaret.
Thanks, Chris. As Chris said, I'm Margaret Schreiber, and I live in two worlds. I live in the world of liturgical studies and in catechetics, well, and also the D-Min, so I kind of roam around, but I do teach the undergrads, and I have a course 240, which is Christian prayer, liturgy, and sacraments. And so that's sort of the underground where I'm going to do my presentation. But my presentation is really on student engagement and a model of doing discussion with students that I have found somewhat successful in my class. But before we actually get into it, let's go around and just introduce ourselves to one another so I know who you are. I know a lot of you, but I don't know. Oh. I know a lot of you, but not all of you. So if you tell me your name and what program you're in, and then we'll at least know who's here.
I'm Christy, and I'm in the Lit Studies Sacramental Theology program.
And she's one of my students.
Bill Dingus, Religion and Culture.
Good.
Neil Sloan, I'm dissertating in systematic theology.
Oh, I don't envy you. Thank you.
Kevin DiPrinzio, spirituality.
Andi Dharmawanto, I'm STL, systematic theology.
Leslie D. Francisco, I'm biblical studies. Dana Christensen, religion and culture.
I'm Stefanos Alexopoulos, liturgical studies.
Carl Dott, School of Philosophy.
Great.
And I apologize if I didn't fully introduce myself. I'm Chris Bourne. I'm the director of the teaching and learning program, and also in the religion and culture area. So.
Great. Great. Okay, so this is a discussion. I have some material to present, but please interrupt at any point if you have any questions about what I'm talking about. It's about learning and teaching and learning, and so student engagement. And this I have titled A Model of Class Discussion, or For Class Discussion. So some of my presuppositions about this include that my experience tells me that students don't read the assignments. Students do not know how to read the assignments. So I begin with that supposition as I prepare my course. I also have found that students can't really participate in a meaningful conversation unless they have read the assignments. So in order to have some meaningful conversation with the students, they have to read the assignment. But we all know that that doesn't necessarily happen. And I do want to avoid just simply students giving their opinion, or students or the whole conversation just being pooling of ignorance in the class. And so I have found that students aren't disciplined in discussing their ideas, but they are professionals at giving their opinion, and sometimes being extremely opinionated with no substance. But we have learned, in our program First Year Experience has told us that students really do like to work together, and they learn from each other. So, but part of their problem is their lives are so busy, as all of our lives are busy. So it's hard for them to get together and really have a conversation about their courses because of their constraints according to their schedule and time. So in that way, forming groups can be something beneficial to them. So we form groups. I have them pick a number. Now that sounds very primary, but it's amazing. You know, really, I'm my first life a primary grade teacher, so the only difference is the bodies are bigger, basically. But anyhow, and along that line, a couple of things to just make clear what I'm talking about. When I was teaching in the first year experience, my students were having an extremely difficult time seeing that the creation story 1 and 2 were different. They just kept telling the story and mixing everything together. And so I said, okay, tonight, now this would be my first grade experience. You go home and you fold your paper and you get 6 boxes. And you draw every day of creation in that box. Well, I thought I was really going to have problems with them the next class saying, why are you treating us like little kids? Well, they were so excited to show their pictures and to say, I never realized that this is how the story goes. I did day 1 and I put the sun in and found out that day 4 is when the sun was created and I had to start all over. So sometimes we think that some of our engagement with the students is very primary, which it is, but if it's teaching them something, it's beneficial. So we pick a number. That's how we get our groups formed. So as they come into the classroom, I have the numbers out face down. They pick a number in order to decide an order for forming our groups. And then they're able to choose their group based on a number. In this particular course, I have 4 groups. One is architecture, one is books, liturgical books, one is music, and one is liturgical vessels. And so whoever has number 1 gets to choose number 1. So the first 4 people are happy. The last one is usually not happy because she or he has to take whatever group is left over. But this helps, I have found, to not necessarily allow them to choose their group. Well, they are choosing their group to an extent, but not to form their own group, because then it tends to be a fun time, or I'm going to be with my friends, and then it's not as productive. So once the group is formed, then the students have to take, well, if architecture gets filled and somebody wants architecture, once it's filled, they have to choose something else. So it's a rather controlled way of forming the group, but I have found it to be pretty successful. So the directives that I give them is that, as I said, they don't read the assignment, they don't want to read the assignment. And so this is the text that we use. So you can imagine, this is pretty hefty text. So what I have them do is each chapter has a beginning of the historical and cultural basis for this particular church history era. And at the end of the chapter, it has a Eucharistic theology. So I do some lecturing on the historical and the cultural and the Eucharistic theology. Then the chapter has a whole section for that era on architecture that happened, that was influenced by this culture history, then the books, the liturgical books, how they were influenced, music and vessels. So the group work is based on those sections of the text that refer to these topics: architecture, books, music, and vessels. So the goal or the objective is to get them to read a section that is not typically more than 5 pages. So I encourage them to read the whole thing, but they are seriously responsible for at least that particular section. So that's how I encourage them. You have to come to class prepared, reading everything, but really understanding this particular section, because this is what you will engage in your conversation. I also provide forms. So it's a very structured kind of class discussion, because my experience tells me unless they have some structure, then it can devolve into just, oh, what are you doing over the weekend? Or what did you do over the weekend? Rather than engaging in the material of the course. So what are my hopes? Well, they actually go beyond the liturgical aspects of this course. My hopes are that they will develop some reading skills, because if you have done any teaching thus far, you will know they don't always have very good reading skills. So the conversation is guided by having to come up with the important points, the big picture. What are the important points in these 5 pages that you read? They also have on their syllabus particular vocabulary related to that era. And my presupposition, my goal is that you can't read this and comprehend it if you don't understand the technical language that is used when we're talking about something in liturgy or anything. But there is a particular language that has to be learned. So I have brought together vocabulary words. So in the context of their reading, they have to define it. And I say to them, don't try to define this by going on Google, because Google is not going to tell you the specific definition of this term as it relates to the context of this particular era in liturgy. So they have to come with their vocabulary words at least outlined, or know they can follow the syllabus and know what the words are. So I want to help develop those skills, but also to develop some critical thinking skills. So they have to, how does the content that I presented in the lectures relate to or connect or disconnect with the things that are going on with architecture, books, music, and vessels? So what is going on in this era when we talk about the liturgy that then causes the architecture to change? So for example, just to get a better picture for those of you who are not real familiar with the liturgy. So in the very early days of the church, the architecture was the house. They simply had their liturgy in the house. And so the vessels that they used were their domestic vessels. They were from their home. And then as time went on, they began to build cathedrals, and they started to use very fancy vessels. Music shifted from very simple Jewish chant to very complicated Gregorian chant. And the books then also developed. And they have to see all these connections that are going on that interrelate. So the effort is to help them develop those critical thinking skills that lead them through this process of making these connections. So they have to keep in mind as they're discussing what are the historical, cultural, and theological shifts that are taking place in history, and what impact does that have on the whole picture of liturgy, especially related to those 4 areas. And then the hope is that they're going to have some kind of a theological discussion that has some substance to it. That they're not just sitting around talking about, oh, I just love this church, or I just love this book. But why? What's going on? Why is it so distinct in this particular era? So what's the big idea? That's number 1. So they have to choose 5 to 10 points that they found in that reading that it gives the big idea. What are the topic sentences that are part of this particular reading? What's the main idea? So in order to get to those 5 points, they have to have a discussion about it. They have to discuss in general the content of their particular reading. Then they have to agree. They have to agree about the most important points. They have to develop an ability to argue for their point. Why is this point so important? Or why is his or her point more important? So they have to whittle it down to Five at the least, and no more than 10. So that's what they have, and that's on a sheet that they have to fill out and turn in. So they have to come to an agreement. They have to discuss it and then come to an agreement about those particular topics. And then they have to make the connections, as I have been saying, to make the connections of the overall content and do that. So they have to then articulate a sentence that articulates or synthesizes the information. So they try to take something large and begin to synthesize it. So it's kind of writing skills also that are involved in this. As I mentioned, it's all about words and definitions. So on the syllabus, they have the words that they have to find in the context of their reading, and they have to define it so that they have, it's not just a bunch of words with definitions, but they have a context for it. And my premise is, if you don't know the meaning of the words, you can't understand what you're reading. Part of the whole development of good, strong reading skills. So find the words, find them in the context, and together come to a definition of that word that is a sentence long. And again, it's about the context, defining it in the context. What's important here is life is full of shifts, and this is what our book is really about. It just shows all the shifts that go on throughout history in the liturgy. So if they come with the thinking that the Latin Mass was the very earliest way that Mass happened, they're going to find out very quickly that there's a whole bunch of history that came way before that happened. And they will be able to identify the shifts, and the shifts will make sense to them. And that's what I find is taking them through this. They really begin to see the big picture of our whole history of the liturgy, that what they thought has always been isn't necessarily what has always been. So clearly our book is very good about that, the shifts, and so I highlight that in the discussion. But then again, they have to come up and synthesize what they discuss and put it in a sentence explaining what happened in the era before. So we're constantly reviewing what happened before and moving them a step further into it. Yeah?
So Margaret, are they still doing this in a group context?
Yes. All of this is when they come together, it's a group work. Peer pressure. It's really good sometimes. So the participants have to contribute. And if they don't, they aren't allowed to sign the sheet that gets turned in. So this is participation grade. And so several things play into this idea of good, healthy peer pressure, okay? So there's group decision making that goes on. There's pressure to do the reading, because if they don't, they can't participate in the discussion or can't do it very well, and they can't sign, so then there's no participation grade. So that's what goes on in the discussion. Yeah?
Is the form given to them with the reading, or do they get it for the discussion?
They get it for the discussion, and I have, I'll show you, I have it from my Blackboard, exactly what that form looks like and how they fill it out. So once they've had their discussion, we have to go beyond the discussion. So some of the things that go on are, first of all, somebody has to be the scribe. Somebody has to write things down. And that sometimes is, again, decision-making within the group. One student has to be the presenter. And I'm going to talk about those specifics. And these roles are to change. They're to rotate. So it's not always the same person who's writing. It's not always the same person who gives a presentation at the end, but they share that. So the scribe is someone who can print clearly. So what I find is, actually, I'm kind of amazed. They don't know how to write cursive, but they do know how to print. So, and well, I mean, I can read it. It's amazing. So typically we don't have a problem, but once in a while I have a student that is you know, the writing is not good, the student understands that and asks to not. And then that person might have to do 2 presentations. Or that group has to work with it. The group has to decide these things. I don't decide it. I tell them to make decisions among themselves so that everything is fair. Again, I mentioned that they share it. So, and sometimes the student isn't able to do that. So again, I try to go even beyond the whole discussion and just justice and compassion for one another, but also justice, that one student doesn't get to do nothing, but the group decides that. The presenter, again, this can be done by the group or by the individual, but it's a responsibility that is shared among them. And so a different person is to present each week. And they can do it one of 2 ways. One is that the student who is the presenter has to synthesize. There's a lot of synthesizing that goes on here. So they have to synthesize the whole conversation because they've had a 35, 40-minute discussion. They can't use another 35, 40 minutes to do the presentation. So they have less than 5 minutes basically to just give us the kernel of what they said, what they talked about in their group. So picking out, even synthesizing those 5 points into 1 or 2 in a sentence or 2, and then going through the rest of and I'll show you that form, going through the rest of the form so that the students have some sense of what they discussed. So just a few points, and they have to articulate the shift that took place. So in the last era, this happened, and now this happened, so that they are always making the connections from what went before to what is now in preparation to move to a next era. And they have to define the vocabulary for everyone, because they will be tested on the vocabulary. So once the forms are completed, I then scan them in and post them on Blackboard, and I'll show you a sample of that. So they're collected, and this is what's important. So they haven't necessarily gone into much of an in-depth discussion about vessels, but they did about architecture. They're still responsible for the information that is in the other areas. And that's why the presentation is given, an opportunity to ask questions. Do you understand? Do you have a general idea of what went on in this particular area, this particular topic? So they have that opportunity, and they are told from the beginning, you have to pay attention. And you have to look at the summary sheets, because you will be responsible for the material that's in there in general ways. Be able to, basically what ends up happening is their final exam is an essay in which they better do better than try, in which they pull together this, and they can bring an outline of it, but they pull together all the historical shifts that took place in the liturgy throughout history. So they're given fair warning way ahead of time. Okay, so any questions about that? Or comments? Or yeah, Chris?
How big are your groups?
Well, I've been blessed with a very small classroom. So I usually try to keep it between 4 and 5. So when I used to have 30, I would have 2 groups of each. So that's how I would do it. So I keep it at 4 or 5 at the most.
And so each group deals with a different, like one dealing with vessel, one dealing with architecture, or they're dealing with different time areas?
No.
Okay.
Okay, so good question. So it's one era.
Okay.
So we just finished Jewish Roots, 30 to 100. So that's the era that everybody was discussing, but then discussing architecture that is in that particular era. Then another group is discussing the liturgical books in that particular era.
Okay.
So if you have more than one group, there are 2 groups discussing architecture in that era, but they both submit the forms, and then they even have more information.
Do the groups persist throughout the whole semester? So like if someone's in the architecture group, that's what they're in the whole semester?
Yes. And I market it that you will be the expert in architecture. You will be the expert in this particular era. And their final exam essay then articulates that. So they identify that this is their area, and then they look at the other things in light of that particular area, because my expectation is that they will have that in depth. Does that always happen? Well, for it. Yes?
And do the groups gather at every class session?
No. So I have two periods. I do Monday, Wednesday, Friday. So 55 minutes. I do 2 periods of lecture, and my lectures are usually biological also, but it's pretty much the lecture, the content, the foundation for this shift that took place. So I give them the content, and then they take that content and apply it to these particular areas.
So like say they do that on Friday.
Right.
Okay.
Right. So, yeah, and we do end up getting on, because it's 2 days, and so until we have a Monday off, then it's always on Friday, or it's always, yeah. Yeah, but it's 2 days and a discussion.
And you mentioned earlier vocabularies, and you said the syllabus offers vocabularies. What do you mean by that?
On their syllabus, for each of the eras that we have, so for the Jewish roots from 30 to 100, it will say this is the material we're covering. So these are the pages that you have to read about the discussion, about the lecture. These are the pages for the discussion, and here's all the vocabulary. So I have the words listed, and those are the words that they have to understand if they're going to understand what's going on. So shofar, the Jewish instrument, so they would never know what that means. Mishnah, the Jewish books. So they're all right there, and then when they're reading and they come across it, they have to pay attention. They have to figure out and come up with a definition of it. I really believe this is what I struggled with when I first started teaching undergrads, was if they don't have a vocabulary, they can't really engage in the conversation with me. And so I would always be frustrated with having to define every single word as I went along, because they have to, if they're going to learn theology, they better learn the vocabulary. And so that's where this comes from, that I have a real strong sense of giving them a solid vocabulary to engage in any kind of conversation in liturgy.
Speaking of frustration.
Yes, give us your wisdom.
Yeah, here's something that I wrestle with. I mean, I'm never going to resolve this, but in the context of this is an undergrad class on religion and American culture. Okay, so, and it's organized thematically. So the first, or one of the first issues that I try to get them thinking about is looking at the, Puritan experience. I mean, this idea of communitarian utopianism, the idea of, you want to get your spiritual act together, flee into the desert, or you want to create Zion in the wilderness, a beacon unto all nations. Okay. And this, of course, is wrapped into American exceptionalism as a kind of theological, political sensibility. And this starts with the Puritans. So, okay, so they look at that, what was the Puritan experience? And so I give them some stuff. And then I do a fast forward and have them read a piece by Francis Fitzgerald about Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh's Rajneesh Puram. This was this Indian philosophy professor that came to the United States and started this. I mean, they literally built a city near Antelope, Oregon. This is in the early 1980s. Peaked out at about 4,000 members, and then tanked rapidly. But again, sort of a contemporary expression of the same kind of phenomena, okay, in our time, which is to say the subtext here is to get them to see that this is not something, we've been doing this for a long time, human beings think they can start over, Okay, so one way I could do this is this more kind of student engaged. In other words, I could have divided the class one of you be Puritans this half of the class, the other half be Rajneeshis. You know, how are these communities similar, dissimilar, and so forth? So my sense of doing that right, the logistics of that would be a minimum of 4 classes. Okay. An alternative is, and particularly if you're talking about a survey course, that there's a lot of stuff you need to get through, you know, if you want to do a really good survey course. So, you know, Dingus can barrelhead this and in 2 days, you know, basically get to what's the most important stuff here. You know, this is what we need to be aware of. These are ways to connect dots, etc. So you see where I'm going here? It's this sort of this frustration of what's better, you know, that you try to do things that are more engaging, hands-on, if you will, or intellectually speaking, for students, and that necessarily is going to take more time to do that. Or, you know, hey, heads up. And this is not an either or one, you know,
Sure.
giving a more kind of lectured format doesn't preclude student engagement, and I too try to do a kind of Socratic, you know, lecture by asking. But I've always felt that pressure, that where it's, you know, student presentations, and well, you know, fine, but boy, that can eat up time, and
Yeah.
you know, then you're at the end of the semester and we've covered 3 topics basically. So this is something of a caricature, but this
Yes,
is
yes, yes,
what I'm getting.
yes.
What's the, you know, what's more efficacious here? What what's more effective? What's more important? What's more? And obviously, I suppose that would be mitigated by the difference between where you're doing a survey course and, in a sense, by necessity, have to, you know, cover pretty, as opposed to something that's more singularly focused, or,
Yes,
you know,
yes,
more narrow, if you will,
right,
thematically or in its subject matter.
right. And you know, I find, this isn't exactly what you're saying, but I find I have to make adaptations every year just because of the chemistry of the group in front of me. So that always has to determine how exactly I do things. So sometimes they can make connections much faster than in other situations.
I remember starting a religion and ecology class by just simply breaking students into small groups, you know, 4 or 5 students, and then, you know, imagine a sun and the rays. Okay, when you hear the word or the phrase religion and ecology, what comes to your mind? And then write this down, you know, and then have each group present. Great, okay, now we're into the 5th class, and this still isn't over.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I mean, it was interesting, and they came up with, I mean, just free association, they came up with some kind of interesting connections, but wow, that really ate up a lot of time.
Sometimes they like that.
Well, they did, yeah. They enjoyed it.
Any other comments, questions? Yeah.
Kind of wrestling with just trying how you get kind of different kinds of students with different backgrounds into the discussions, and so kind of the background I'm thinking about is that I taught enduring questions in the spring, and I had a senior theology major, 2 junior theology majors, 2 honor students, a politics student who's, you know, like an A student, really into things, you know, students who would never have taken this unless they thought it was like the easiest distribution requirement they could find. A student who, when it came to the Easter time, asked me, what is Easter? He's not from this country, he's not Christian, and so I think, so one thing that I think has helped me today is just hearing your thoughts on vocab. Because vocab and having students do the prep work necessary to engage in, maybe get everyone on the same level a little bit more in class is important. But just have any thoughts on kind of, or have you had a group maybe where someone's not able to pull their weight and they're kind of just, you know, almost everyone knows it, and how do you maybe intervene or help them?
Well, when this discussion is going on, I'm roaming. So I engage in conversation with each of the groups, at least to some extent, and particularly if things aren't going well. What I would do if they know this is their participation grade. So So I typically don't have a lot of problems, but last semester, for the first time, the group decided that one student could not sign the sheet. That didn't happen again. That did not happen again. And that was their decision. There was no animosity, you know, they just, and I was watching because I could tell she was just kind of disengaged with the whole thing, and I didn't have to deal with it in the end, you know, so kept me going. This is a good plan here. So, but I do think that what you're talking about is the reality that we have. We have students that are across the board, especially about religion and theology. You know, some have a very depth of it, and others, they are from a country where they've never talked about religion or had religion. And then you've got those who have a lot, but they don't like being Catholic, or they're in a bad place. They don't want anything to do with religion. So you've got all kinds. I really focus on, this is an academic subject. You have this, you're going to pass or fail on not whether you love God or not. My hope is that they do love God, but that's, you know, that's not something I can deal with. I'm not doing catechesis when I'm in there. I'm teaching. And so they have to listen to the lecture and do the assignments. And what I have found, some of my best students, just because it's all so new to them, they just eat it up more than some of the other students. So they have to listen to the lectures, they have to do the vocabulary, and they have to engage in the conversation. And it's been working for me.
And do you monitor the discussions on Blackboard, or are these discussions take place in class?
They take place in the classroom, right? So I teach lecture 2 days. They have a day, because I'm the Monday, Wednesday, Friday. So I have one day that I reserve every third day for discussion.
So that's when the groups get together and actually work on...
Yes, together, right. And so then this is the result. So the group
Actually, it's put together in class, not
put in,
outside of class.
correct. It's put together in class, but then I scan it. So I just pulled this off of Blackboard. So I scan it, and you can see they have to identify their group. They have their main points. They have to give the relationship between Christian life liturgy during this particular era, which is 30 to 100. How do we get this to move down? And then there's their vocabulary. So they have to define their vocabulary words. Whoops. And then they have their final statement, and then there's their signatures. So this, and then this, they bring the shift that took place. Now this is the first era, so there's no real shift, but they take that sentence to their conversation in order to write it for the next era. So this is what happened in this era, and in the next era something else happened. So it's a methodology, it's a pedagogy of when you teach a class, you typically begin by reminding or telling them what you're going to do. At the end of the class, you sort of tell them what you did, and then the next class you begin by, you know, reviewing, but not in great detail, so that they continue to get the context of what we've done and where we're going. Does that make sense? So that piece, the shift that took place, is important to keep connecting, because it's a historical, chronological development. Now, not every course is that way, so something like that might not work in another course, but it's trying to make the connection from the end of this class to the end of the second class to the end of, and then they sign off. 3 students that did cursive. I must frame that. Any other comments or something you've experienced that would be helpful for all of us to hear about, or related to having class discussions? Or anything, really. I can go beyond that, yeah.
Yeah, I think when I do certain activities, I can stress you need to read in order to participate in this activity. I have students schematize and like draw. I bring in those big sheets of paper, and they read Peter Berger's The Sacred Canopy, the first 2 chapters. They break out into groups, and it's like, in order for you to participate, you have to have read this material. So they get in groups of 4, and they draw the chapter. They draw an element of the chapter, and then they present it at the end, and I film it and throw it up on Blackboard. You know, they show the symbolism of his externalization, objectivation, and internalization, or whatever from the chapter. But I feel like I only have that bullet in my pocket so many times during the semester. You know, where I would say, it's like, you have to read to participate in this activity. I can't say that for my class is also Monday, Wednesday, Friday. I can't use that for, okay, Monday you have to read, you know. So I reserve that for certain times, because I also understand, you know, how to get them to read. So do you find that like they may not be reading on that Monday, Wednesday, and then they're picking up their readings on Friday to be able to participate in this? Or do you still feel like they could skirt by with just these forms?
Oh, yeah, I know what you're saying. Yeah, no, my assumption is they don't read anything until this. Yeah. You know, that's my assumption. There are some students who do. Is that a safe assumption? Yeah. Well, and you know what I find too, you know, this doesn't go on too often because there is some peer pressure here, because they've got to turn this in. They've got to sign it and turn it in, and they know it's going to count on their participation grade. So occasionally I will find that speed readers, they've not read it. Even before class, they've not read it. Okay. You know, and they're speed reading through it, or, you know, you can tell they're not paying attention. And then of course when I show up in the group, things do shift a little bit, but yeah, so as much as my hope is that they are, the bottom line is that they'll at least read 5 pages out of maybe 25 pages. I rejoice and be glad if they've read 1 or 2. You know, and this is something that's interesting. I really do give them probably more freedom than, well, I think it's okay to give them the freedom, because I do. But what I have found, I never stop them, but some of the groups are very creative. And so at the end of when they finish their discussion, they start assigning paragraphs. I mean, they are minimalists. They are minimalists. So they start assigning paragraphs. Okay, so you do this section for next week, and you do this section for this, and you do that. I have to say, I'm pretty impressed with their final exam. They really comprehend better than I think if I was just teaching it to them these eras. But they get creative about, you know, but they're minimalists, you know? I mean, they can't even read 5 pages, you know, a paragraph, you know?
Along those lines, I've often wondered, I give a study guide for reading. There are 10 questions. So what's really going on there? I mean, does that mean they're going to read the article and then try to answer the questions, or am I inadvertently giving them opportunity not to read the article, which is to say, just simply address these questions?
Yeah, it's a challenge.
What's the, again, more efficacious, or what's the more productive, you know, don't give them anything and let them struggle with it until, you know, or give them questions and risk that they're really not going to read it and just.
Yeah, it's the bottom line for me is through the whole course, I'm not going to come in here and be angry because you haven't done the assignments. I'm not going to be angry that you did, you know, I collect the assignments, somebody doesn't come in, okay, well, the consequences are you fail, you know? So I enter the classroom with that attitude of, I'm coming, I'm going to enjoy this, I'm going to teach, we're going to have a conversation, and the consequences of not participating, not reading, will show up in the exams, and particularly my final is cumulative. So I say to them, it's a cumulative exam. If you want to cram finals week, it's okay. But that's how, you know, and they have exams all the way through, but I mean, I've come to not, I don't want to use my energy that way of just being aggravated every class because they haven't done the assignments or they haven't done the readings. And so, I don't know if that's good or bad, but that's how I operate. Stephanos, you had a question.
Yeah, well, I like very much what you do because it's not just teaching the class, but So hopefully, I mean, other than understand, I teach the same class this semester, and I mean, we've talked
Yes.
about this. But other than just giving them the shifts and trends and major points in that, you also, what I think I'm seeing students getting out of this, other than knowledge, is also methodology, which I think it's very important. And it's one of my frustrations teaching this class where sometimes I feel I'm like hitting a wall. The other thing, it's a more general question that I appeal to your experience is, I teach, my class is 30 kids. So I have a wide range of people that are very interested, to people that aren't interested at all, people that are straight A students, people that might fail the class. In such a large class, what do you do to like shake up the students that are towards the lower grade scale without doing injustice to the better students? Is it like a personal thing that you take them on the side? Is it something that you do within the class? For example, we have a second test for my class next Tuesday, this coming Tuesday, which covers this book. So I thought I would like leave a lecture out and on Thursday go with them through the study guide and help them, in a sense, sort of like establish a study principle, more or less based on this idea. So I'm trying to cover some ground and make sure that what I want them to remember, I review with them. So I don't know. Well, I think we lost track of the question here.
Well, I think one of the things you were saying is, what do you do with those who are disengaged completely? And others, I'm sure, can contribute to this. Basically, one of the things that I do, if I see a student is failing midterm, kind of look it over, who's really doing poorly, I'll pull them aside. I'll invite them. Now, some just refuse to answer my email, and then that's fine. We just move on and they fail. But I do invite them to come and find out, why are you not, what's going on? What can you do to see if you can't pass this course? But you're not going to pass if you continue the way you're going. And then I'm done, pretty much. If they're interested and they put forth an effort, even want to come back, I will engage them. But I throw it back at them and say, here's where you are in this course.
So
and
it doesn't change what you teach or how you teach in the classroom setting?
Not if it's one or two. Now, if I see the whole class is starting to fail, or then I'd have to really reflect on what am I doing, because clearly I'm doing something that's causing all of them to, or 90% of them, or even 75% of them, to not be doing well. But Bill and Chris, you have experience with this.
I try to convey overtly and covertly. Folks, in the final analysis, you are responsible for your education. And the other thing is that there's, what we teach and how we teach and so forth, and we try to do that well and so forth. But there's also a kind of, call it a seductive dynamic here, and that is, why does this matter? I mean, ultimately, who cares, and so what? There were Puritans and there were Rajneeshis. So I try really hard to try to get them to see this is why this matters. And so if you can connect it to their life world, if you will, if you can connect it to something, I don't like the word relevant, but if you can connect it in a way that they can see this has some utility, some significance, this is not just some, academic abstract thing that cares. So I'm always struggling to,
Yeah.
why does this matter?
And
In their 19-year-old or 20-year-old Weltanschauung, I mean, where are those heads, and why is this significant?
And our course is, pretty much our course description is, how does liturgy and life connect? And so we've got sort of a built-in it doesn't always mean they're going to be interested, but it is this constant, well, what does this mean? You know, how does this connect to your life? So I think that is helpful, I think, in doing that.
Has been made, and it's important that, again, recognizing that oftentimes, given the nature of the class, you can have people all over the place in terms of their interests, their knowledge, and so forth. And that's a different kind of class than if you have something that's a little bit, again, more specialized, or you can assume that, you know, 20 of the 26 students, you know, have an interest in that kind of thing. I mean, we deal with different constituencies, obviously, and that's going to affect what we do and the success of
Yeah,
how we do.
that's right. That's right. I have a comment about engagements because, enduring questions, I mean. I taught that class the very first year I was here. This was my favorite line. So they're all leaving. This is enduring questions. Got it? Students are leaving the class and they said, she did it again. She didn't answer our question. I love that line. It's like, okay, we don't even get the title of the class, let alone the content of the class.
I have two logistical questions about it. One is, how much does participation factor into the final grade?
20%.
And your lecture, so the reading and the discussion topic is obviously pretty important. How do your lectures relate to that? And in particular, like, do your lectures kind of prepare the new discussion for Friday?
Exactly.
Or does Friday kind of set off a discussion that gets finished
No.
with?
The discussion follows the foundation that I lay regarding this particular era. So what's going on in this era historically, culturally, and theologically. And then they see or my hope is they see the connections then with how how these factors, these four areas get impacted and change because of, so hopefully they're getting all these they don't get all of them, pardon me, but they're getting some connections with it all. So yeah, so it's, I lay the foundation, then they make connections in areas outside of how, or make connections as to how history, culture, and theology impact these other areas. And again, you know, obviously I do this because it all kind of fit together. So there would be a lot of adaptations that would be needed in another course, but I think at least what I'm trying to convey most directly is that when we do discussion with students, we can really have an impact on developing some skills, how to synthesize a lot of material, how to develop some critical thinking skills, and hopefully even to just get them to read the material. So, you know, you wouldn't necessarily have shifts that are going on or that kind of thing, but to develop a way of doing discussion with students that addresses some of those skills, even presentation skills, you know, to have to, I always say, you know, we have a couple of priests in here, but anyhow, when it's harder to give a homily in 5 minutes than it is to give a homily in 20 minutes because you have to synthesize your thoughts. You have to pull things together. And so that's sort of my helping them develop that skill also to synthesize this material.
Sure, yeah,
One more question, then.
I think a student presentation is a very important element of the last discussion. What do you expect from a student's presentation? And the other one is, what is your desirable presentation way? For example, using PowerPoint or just reading their drafts or whatever.
Okay. I don't allow my students to do presentations because I am not going to sit through it and I'm not going to make my students sit through it. That's my bottom line. So the presentations are very brief. The presentations that they give are, like I said, 3 to 4 minutes on what they discussed. But I don't assign, and this is just, it's my experience with them doing that is, so many times it becomes nothing but an endurance for me and for the students, and to watch the students start just unable to continue to pay attention when there's a 15-minute presentation by an undergrad, I have made a decision to not do it. So again, it's a very structured, it's a very 3 minutes. We can all sit through 3 minutes. But it's painful. It's painful for the student up there, and it's painful for the class. But if I can, as undergrads, if I can get them to give a halfway decent 3-minute presentation on some material, then I feel like I have contributed to the possibility of that student doing better in a graduate course or in their business or whatever. But this isn't an English class, and so and I know that a lot of professors have student presentations, and they are very lengthy, and God bless those who can do that. I can't. I made a decision that, I don't know, do you do a lot of that kind of stuff?
No. 5 minutes tops.
Yeah,
So 5 minutes.
yeah, that's what I find. I have observed student teachers, and I have observed this. I've experienced it because I did it at one point, and I have made a decision that, again, it has to be what I find, and one of the things I hope you heard, very structured, so that there isn't wasting time. That's the main thing. You don't get them in their groups and they start being friendly and, yeah, okay, so, and the other thing is that I didn't mention is they do, because the different eras, sometimes vessels take a lot of time, music takes a lot of time, and then in other weeks they don't take very much time. So they do have time. They can visit with one another, or they wait for one another. So it's not real rigid like that, but it's pretty structured so that they got to get their job done before they can visit. In a lot of weeks, they won't get a chance to visit, and just, so that's my take on presentations. And we could turn off the tape so everybody doesn't hear that, but thank you for listening. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you all. Great discussion, great questions. I mean, the whole goal here is to just share our teaching ideas. Bring your ideas, bring what you do in the class, what you've seen in the classroom, what you've experienced in the classroom, because I mean, this is how we grow as teachers. So thank you very much. Join us on November 12th. Dr. Bosworth will be talking. Great. Thanks. Good. We'll study.